we are. Okay, good morning, everyone, and greetings from Toronto, and thank you for joining us. This is a special webinar series that we're kicking off today. We're working with University of Toronto School of Cities on a special capstone project on covering different master plannings or master plans, international best practices to see what Toronto could learn from these other case studies. And we thought it would be a great addition to this project to invite some of the designers and architects and developers to showcase and share it from their perspective. So I would like to introduce you to Sonia Mataj, who is an architectural designer, and Sonia will introduce our first guest speaker today, and let's kick it off. Thank you for joining us. Sonia.
So KPF is an international architectural practice with offices around the world. Our guest speaker today is Bruce Fisher, a design principal at the New York KPF office. Their projects include the world's tallest towers, longest spans, and most varied programs and inventive forms. The goal that binds their work and what motivates their efforts is finding the smartest solution for each project. KPF sees good design as the product of an open-minded search.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Great. Okay, so thanks for the opportunity to speak today. The talk is pretty short, although I've tried to pack a lot in here, so you'll have to bear with me, but it grows out of our interest in the office in how intuition, how our processes of, say, sketching, of going to a site, looking at that, having an intuitive response, how that can be fused with really measuring and building a design through measured elements that mix the analytical data with initial intuitive ideas. And I think that there are many things that define our office, but I think number one is the belief in the power of urban architecture and cities in their multiple forms. And we know working around the world, they do come in multiple forms, but the power of these places as mixing chambers, as places for innovation, we really believe in that and try to strengthen that. And we also are a multi-generational firm. We've been around for 40 years. So we actually are always kind of evolving our knowledge. We have a deep knowledge base, but we're always evolving and infusing that with more knowledge. And I say today we're in a period where we have looked at the degree to which AI, the degree to which our analytical tools can drive design. And we've come to this point where we really believe in the analog, the intuition, what we know through the deep bench of knowledge, what we learn, all of us day to day walking around cities. There are initial responses and intuitive responses that we trust. But the question is then, how do we take those and build off of those and really build intelligence into those probably start points that are very good ideas? We work around the world, as was mentioned, but I think the important thing about this is that we really do learn. We believe that our 700-person firm is important, that it's stationed in New York, London, Shanghai, for instance, because we're always learning from the projects we do. We work on very diverse projects in diverse neighborhoods, diverse cities, but the knowledge that's learned in one place, we really can infuse that in how we might innovate in another. And of course, we're architects, so we have a great understanding of typologies, a super broad understanding of typologies, whether it's education, I'm kind of going from left to right here, top to bottom, but education, culture, retail, and leisure environments, whether it's innovating the office, housing, hotels, transport. I'm not listing everything here. We're very involved in all of these types of architecture, and we kind of know the latest trends because we're doing so much work. And all of this fuses together in terms of our urbanism. It really informs how we believe we can shape blocks, shape streets, because it's about space, but it's also about the way in which typologies and programs can fit and fuse together and synthesize to make very, very vital places. Our office, in terms of technology, has three kind of pieces beyond just the architecture. We're very involved in growing our urban planning and kind of theory behind that, but also our environmental performance team is very involved with how buildings and cities perform, and our urban interface team is dealing with many of the tools that help us measure buildings. So today I'm going to quickly go through three neighborhoods, and they're very different. They're from around the world. So we'll start with Covent Garden, because we'll look at Covent Garden, which is obviously in the UK. look at a North American site and an Asian site. And these are all very, very different. And I just want to show the diversity of what we do and how we think about it. So as you know, Covent Garden is a 400-year-old, very ancient, famous piece of London, and just cutting right to the chase. There's many stories to tell about it, but by the 1990s, this had become a place that was really about tourism. It wasn't a place that Londoners really would go to. And I think many places around the world, whether it's Venice or you can name many places that become kind of museums, but they're not mixed-use neighborhoods that are really vital in the sense of a living organism that's still really serving the city in many, many ways. And so becoming a tourist destination, Londoners tended to avoid that. But of course, there's a beautiful fabric here, this ancient piece of London. And so the challenge for us, what we were asked to look at was analyze it and figure out how we could infuse more programs into it and also change patterns of movement. The existing site plan, if you look at this sketch, had a lot of east-west movement, which happened to be along more of a tourist circuit, but the north and south neighborhoods were not connected to these kind of more London neighborhoods. So if you look at the boxes, these were kind of initial ideas, again, intuitive responses of where we might and how we might build in some surgically placed new program, but also how could we infuse a porosity into the site and bring much more north-south connection. So we analyzed this. We looked at one site, and one in particular was Floral Court, which seemed very possible from the developer's point of view as a test case. So we actually took the internal guts of the block, which were built out with kind of miscellaneous structures that had been built over time. We hollowed that out and actually built new alley connections through existing buildings into that space. And this shows the kind of courtyard, and Covent Garden is made up of courtyards. So we were kind of taking the existing fabric and building more intimate spaces within it. And this shows the built out scenario where in fact we did build these alleys, we hollowed out the interior of the block, and within that allowed us to, in this case, build new housing, which is very kind of valuable housing for Londoners, something that would infuse a kind of 24-hour life and a place where Londoners would want to live. As well as we had new retail components, new F&B opportunities that were more hidden in a cloistered, discovered space. And this shows that one example of how we've built out new housing that fits right within the fabric of the city. We were also fascinated with London, working there, not London, but Covent Garden specifically, working there so intimately on the scale of this space and how intimate it was, how good it made one feel. And of course, we can measure street widths and building heights, and that is certainly a very important measure for how we understand space. But we also were interested in figuring out how we might measure space in another way. How does the degree of openness and closed qualities of alleys and streets, like how do we measure that as a kind of wavelength? And this again was the kind of experimentation that our UI group does. And you can see here that you get these peaks and valleys where it's more open at the peaks, it's more closed. And this gave a kind of rhythm, a kind of a heartbeat that's arrhythmic, but has a certain kind of level of highs and lows within that path. And we took that same knowledge, knowing that we love London so much and Covent Garden and the intimacy of these streets. We then took that same tool and measured Midtown streets. We measured Brasilia. These are neighborhoods within. We compared Covent Garden, pieces of Paris, Sun City, Arizona. And what that allowed us to do is come up with this series of wavelengths. And I know this is probably hard to read, but Covent Garden is here. You can see that in terms of its spatial openness. If the top is the most open and the base of this diagram is the most closed. And you can see the tight rhythm of Covent Garden relative to, say, the space of Brasilia. Or if you look at Midtown Manhattan, you can see that there's a kind of more rhythmic spatial measurement that typifies that. And so we use this tool to measure other things. So for example, looking at a kind of retail mall, another typology in Bangkok, we actually used the kind of scale of the wave, the understanding of the wave, the distances between peaks and valleys to help us design an equally evocative, perhaps more evocative method of walking through this mall. What do you see? How many crenellations do you have? What are the larger spaces? What are the smaller spaces? And that was a kind of application of taking what we learned from Covent Garden, using digital tools to analyze it and apply it to other places. Another project is Downtown West. We bring this out because you have to pardon the open access. This is just things I downloaded from our internet. But the important thing about this site is it's like so many North American sites, it's on the fringe. And it's a place where there's redevelopment. There's the desire to make this a much more dense, mixed use, something that has an identity that you could say from a placemaking point of view, really becomes something very strong and more like a downtown. And so we did not do the original site plan for this. Site Labs was responsible for this, but what we received was a kind of layout of how buildings might lay out on blocks, the basic idea of a green belt that runs through this, all very important initial decisions. But in terms of the look and feel of the place and how we were inspired, again, intuition, going to the site, the inspiration for this was some of the existing vestiges from the past, the industrial qualities of the site. And that led us to, before we even start any design work per se, looking at, okay, what would the feeling be that we would want on this site with high rise, low rise, the old and the new, multiple programs of retail, work, and living. And we also looked at how blocks and how we might think about some blocks being more consistent, some being more diverse. And then we, with those initial ideas, took to looking at individual sites. And this is a residential site, and trying to really measure, this is true for all the blocks, what would be some of the best configurations if we wanted something that was more stratified vertically. And what we're looking at here is the things that we're combining are a parking grid, a very reasonable residential grid, views, sunlight, thermal comfort. All of that is integrated to help us form the ultimate envelopes that we're recommending for these various sites. Another way that we use data in a site like this is looking around the existing neighborhoods, and really through Google Places and other means, and GIS, but Google Places is particularly interesting in understanding what exists within the site already, where we can infuse different kinds of programs. How do we not cannibalize adjacent neighborhoods while building in these new programs? And all of this leads to a kind of vision and image of the place. And in this case, we're looking at, a retail street. We've generally got the idea of orientation and shapes of buildings. We know how views work. This allows us to imagine now, it's not all built out, and to imagine for others how this place might look with the more intimate space, the wider open spaces, where high and low might work best, and also where nature might be most innovated and green into this city. Now, the issue with projects like this is what I really want to talk about is, so you have a master plan, it's got a 20-year lifespan. You're going to have hundreds of consultants, dozens of architects in this case, coming in to actually design the buildings. How do we retain and measure what's happening over time? How does the client know what one building looks like relative to another? How do we synthesize all this information? What KPF has been hired to do is actually be the precinct architect, where we are digital stewards of making sure that all of the data from various architects, that all of the zoning ideas, that the key ideas about materiality, all of that lives in one place. And what we have is essentially a series of data sets that understand the overall development relationships between projects. They track areas and phasing. They allow us instant walkthroughs. So because it's all in 3D using BIM and 360 assets, allows us to do walkthroughs and fly-throughs based on the current project design, and visualize consolidated sets of data that enable faster kind of onboarding for other consultants. And this is kind of back of house work, but is so fundamental, we feel, going forward for how cities and these master plans can actually evolve from the original image that one wants, the kind of look and feel, the placemaking qualities, how we actually make sure that that gets built into this development over time. The other part of this is getting the community to buy into density in these various places. There's NIMBYs everywhere. There's a general intuitive response. Development is bad, density is bad. And what this platform has allowed us to do is, in a public setting and online, really show people what density might mean. If you dial it way up, okay, maybe there's more shadow, there might be some negative effects. If you say in a middle zone with density, actually there's this much more tax that comes to the city. That allows all of these parks. We get much more affordable housing. So we're trying to show to people visually through their own ability to kind of dial up and dial down different issues to visualize what the city might be and how this really does impact them. And this has been very effective for the Hawaiian Housing Authority and other places where we're working. And because this can be, online, it's something that people can really play with online, look at trends like, if there's more density, if there's less density, again, understand what that means. The last project I'm going to go through is a project that we worked on in Shenzhen. It's more of an internet city. The master plan winner was MBBJ. And what we were given was one site to study within this master plan. And what was given was the block area, the neighborhood area, of course, the water edges, main streets, and also this idea of this line, this commons that was going to thread together all of the various sites. And again, our start point is always still this kind of sketch ideas. Before we analyze the site relative to climate and things like that, but initial ideas are still growing out of our intuitive responses, how we might intelligently bring in various uses, how we might intelligently connect water to the deep part of the site. In this case, if you look at this funny little first sketch, how we might bring the nature into the center of the site. The water views were excellent, but actually it was a kind of harsh environment, the interior. So a start point was, well, how might we bring the most green to the most people? And that led to diagrams. This is a kind of traditional planning process that we all go through, but party diagrams and other concepts such as, concepts for how energy might be absorbed in these taller buildings, a very hot climate, how we might shade, incredibly humid climate, how we might have a zone of comfort, how we might have a zone of resilience. These grow out of our collective knowledge of what might make sense, but it's a concept. And now it comes to sort of testing. We lay out these forms, we have start points, and then we really look at the climate issues, the views, where connections want to occur, how wind is flowing through the site. And in fact, we are shaping and molding these forms to really work with those various forces, leading to a kind of overall clear kind of site plan idea. And again, looking at the wind and porosity, but also really trying to test in multiple kind of iterations how we can better deal with solar radiation. How do we absorb the most sunlight for solar kind of energy, but also how do we keep the light out of the interior? And these kind of very iterative and multiple ways through our parametric design of finding good solutions, it allows us to relatively quickly come up with optimal solutions. So whether that's dealing with sun to reduce the carbon footprint, whether this is a kind of experimental analysis, really understanding in terms of these covered walkways and getting people from one place to another, how much sun is exposed within these places. How do we make these places more covered and thermally more comfortable? So this, in fact, maps through these dots the hottest and the coolest places. This allows us to hone where open panels are, where we might want more covering. And this is a very kind of specific exercise that allows great specificity in the ultimate design. And this shows a kind of vision based on that, how we build out those canopies to have the right balance of sunlight, wind, thermal comfort, resilience, even materiality is embedded in here to synthesize the optimal solutions. We can also do this in terms of measuring green space and access to nature. We have our green heart. So what we were trying to do here was ensure that building facades, the maximum number of facades, have a view of the green as one is walking, whether you're going through this forest, which we'll see in a minute, or not. The idea that visually you're connected to this green. So actually trying to increase that access to nature through, again, an initial idea and then really honing the architecture and the urban form to make sure that works. And this shows a kind of synthesis of that idea. Again, a very natural kind of heart to the site, that's very involved with part of our resilience strategy, but also creates a nice, from a placemaking point of view, counter between the architecture and nature, and also allows for everyone to be very aware of this very special natural place within the overall project. In terms of spatial variety, going back to where we started with Covent Garden, we can also measure, and we know that we want these places of compression, these places of expansion. And this map also shows, the transitions from spatially compressed areas to more open areas. And we want to enhance that spatial variety. So when we see that it's lacking, there's a monotony in that wavelength. We know where to build more bumps or various ways of shaping that landscape that one experience to make it more interesting. And again, the whole idea of 15 or 5-minute city. In this case, we have a close enough neighborhood that we were working very closely to make connections the most efficient that they could be between places, both at grade and in the air, but also making sure that those correspond with the areas where we want the most thermal comfort. And this shows a kind of image of that, those bridges and the connection of buildings. And lastly, in terms of this idea from a resilient point of view, of really measuring the way in which this can work as a sponge city through rainforest filtration, through green roofs, through rain gardens. We also can measure all of that to understand quantify very clearly within our architecture firm. We're not engineers, but we can quantify and make sure that our design as we're building through the process is actually meeting these goals. And these are some other images of that study and process. So to end, I think that's really what I wanted to go through today. This, again, comparison and understanding this, how we're fusing the kind of sketchy, intuitive ideas with the data. And I would say that, looking at machine learning and really trying to push the limits to which, say, machine learning or our tools can design for us, we still are at a point where we really have come to believe that the power of the mind, the power of our collective thought, our intuitive, creative responses, our idiosyncratic responses, we trust in the intelligence of those as long as we can really measure them and make sure that ultimately those things fuse together for the best kind of design ideas, best solutions. So that's it.
Bruce, thank you so much. That was, I have to say, so refreshing. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. It was, and I will ask a question after Sonia's questions, because I always say, like, we're so low tech and everything is just so, intuition based, as you said. But Sonia, and please, I invite the audience to type your question in the chat or Q&A. If I see that I accidentally disabled the chat, I apologize, but there's Q&A. So Sonia, please kick things off with your questions.
Okay, so I'd like to start off with a simple question, which is, what are some of the challenges and opportunities of practicing architecture internationally?
Well, I'll start with the great benefits of it. As I said, I think that we are learning so much by stepping outside of maybe the places that individuals know best. And we are very much through technology as well, our internal ways of accessing data from other people, accessing imagery, accessing ideas, diagrams, knowledge. We really are pushing how much we're sharing and learning from each other. It's become incredibly collaborative, not just in an office through the internet, but internationally. I would say that there's an incredibly seamless integration in how we access work, how we speak. And of course, everyone's going to mention this, the pandemic only pushed that more. We were always doing that. The challenges were the times of day and how we actually deal with this more 24-hour meetings at night, meetings early in the morning. But I think we've been doing that for years. The pandemic just strengthened the ability for people to understand that they don't have to necessarily fly to these places for important meetings, but actually we can do it by Zoom. I would say from a physical point of view, one of the biggest challenges, and particularly again during the pandemic, is getting to places. And when you're in one office, actually making sure that you're in touch with how things are being built. Now, the reason that we have offices around the world is really to very much have people in place. It's not so much to have as many offices as possible. It's strategically placing offices where they can be very much in touch with the work that we're building, because we're not a firm that starts with a concept and then puts it to other firms. Ideally, we're working from concept right through construction to the very end. As much as possible, we try to do that. That's a way of ensuring that we get quality and that we are getting results that we envisioned. So I would say, the ability to, from New York, see everything in person, which is very important being there. For instance, something in China is difficult. And we've also got to contend with, if you're flying around the world a lot, right? This is very antithetical to what we know is probably good from a carbon perspective for individuals and for the world. So I think that's a big challenge today, of the degree to which you need to be hands-on and there, and the degree to which you can actually be remote and making sure things are done with great quality.
Great, thank you for that answer. So the second question is, it seems that KPF uses technology to your advantage by employing a UI team, using parametric design, and creating robust sets of data for your projects. What are the biggest opportunities in the industry out there at the moment in relation to the first part of this question?
Well, I think that like all technology, some of the things that are experimental or are perhaps state of the art, you're doing the research on those very quickly trickle down to everybody in the design world. So I would say a lot of what we're showing is very important to our process, but many of those tools end up being integrated into kind of tools of the trade, be it in BIM and AutoCAD. So I would say that there's this ability that's very quickly for designers to be accessing very easily more and more data to inform their designs. It doesn't have to be so technical. I mean, it is technical, but the access to these tools becomes kind of more user-friendly, more accessible to many, in order to get some of the best work, smartest work.
Okay, great. And the last question, which branches off of the second question, is how do you see the architectural profession evolving in the next 5 years? How do you think that machine learning will reshape the way that projects pan out and the way that architects approach their design?
I don't think I'm going to have a full answer to this. It's a little bit like asking where the office market is going right now in development. But I will say that there's going to be more and more access, as I said, to tools. I think the machine learning, I mean, one example that I found kind of fascinating is, I'm sure many of you have used this, where you can type in, you can write something that's a written description of what you want to see, the place. I want it to be industrial. I'd like it to be brick. I'd like it to be green. And I don't know if you've tested any of this, but you get these amazing collages that come out of this. They're very inspirational, and it's a little scary because it's actually kind of giving you ideas that you actually didn't think of. So I think I'm not the best one to ask this, but I would say that more and more probably will be surprised at what can be leveraged through machine learning in terms of finding data as well, like searching data, comparative analyses. I can imagine being, and it already is, kind of very useful for that. Relative to how it actually, the way we think of it right now with technology is that machine learning is augmenting our designs, what we do, but we still don't believe that you can sort of throw things out there in parameters yet, and we hope not, that sort of allow us to be obsolete as designers. We still really believe in if you think about a painter or art, it's very subjective. There's subjective aspects to it. There's creative aspects to it that just, are kind of do come out of the vision of an individual or a group of people. So I think there's going to be this balance, but exactly where that balance and how that relationship is rebalancing, I think will continue to evolve. It's a non-answer for you.
Thank you, Bruce. So there are 4 more questions that are really good questions. So in large projects, how do you think about what happens on the ground? Programming and architectural articulation, how do you tackle it with, algorithm?
I think we're learning from projects like Covent Garden. I think that we understand what makes things monotonous, what makes them interesting. So it's really variety is how we want to think about the ground plane generally. I mean, if we're talking about kind of urban buildings and places where people want to be in a pedestrian atmosphere, variety is key. And whether that is, in form, materiality, kind of number of breaks and crenellations, porosity, signage, varied versus all consistent signage. I think all of these things factor very much into how we think about the ground plane. And of course, there's other issues that we touched on that more from an environmental point of view, thermal comfort, breezes, sunlight, shade, protection from the elements, like all of those things factor in. So I think in our work, we are trying to consider very specifically, but also broadly, all of the factors that make the ground plane a pleasant place to be, make it vital. And of course, street making is a big part of this, healthy streets. I mean, London, speaking of, they have a great set of the 10 issues that I think are universal that make for a healthy street. And of course, just the way in which a street considers those issues is another important part of the base of buildings, whether those are for cars or shared streets or pedestrian streets. So I think that really one has to look at kind of and understand all of the factors that make a great streetscape and place, and really think about all of them.
Brendan, I'm going to rephrase your question a little bit. So the question is about architecture firms like KPF and tech firms. So Brendan's question was about if they will ever compete, but I actually want to ask you about how is it working today between architecture and tech? What do you see yeah.
So I'll give you a very specific response. It probably doesn't answer all of this, but in the case of our UI group and the people that are building these tools here, they're in high demand. And there's all kinds of opportunities, whether it was once they existed, sidewalk labs or other places that are dealing with kind of more digitally oriented, tech-oriented enterprises. I think that in terms of competition for people and knowledge, that's definitely out there. We can't pay as much as many tech firms, so that's one way. But I would say that what we're finding is that the diversity of knowledge about buildings, in our case, we really understand the DNA of buildings. And if you talk about office, there's all kinds of offices. There's all kinds of residential buildings. There are these nuanced responses that we, as an experienced architecture firm, through our collective knowledge, we really understand a lot about those. So I think what's tough for tech firms so far to compete with us is that again, it kind of comes down to intuition and also embedded knowledge. It's very hard to design urban places, in my mind, without really understanding the components that make up those places. The programs, the buildings, someone asked about the streetscape, all of the components and nuances of variety that make up a good streetscape. And I think it's been difficult from what we've been able to see. We use some tech firms that are actually involved with urbanism. And they may come along and say I'm wrong, but in our case so far, we haven't found that the power of the technical prowess has been able to overcome the actual creation and making of great places. It's a very stratified, kind of complex set of ingredients and thinking that goes into architecture and placemaking.
Okay, we try to keep our webinars no longer than 30 minutes to respect the speakers, of course, busy day, and also the audiences. So with that, we do have more questions. However, the recording is available on our YouTube channel, and I would like to thank Bruce Fisher from KPF New York for joining us. That was an incredible presentation. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. See you